So a lot of you haven't met us at Blend Interactive before, so I just want to give a real brief overview of who we are. So we are located here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, as I mentioned, but we have clients in about 34 states and internationally as well. So location aside, we've become known in the industry as CMS implementation experts, as well as being thought leaders in our respective categories of content strategy, accessible design, and complex integrations. So we would love for you to reach out to us at Blend for any of your web projects in the future, but are happy to do a little thought leadership and educate you today. A little bit about our relationship with Optimizely. We were actually Episerver's first North American partner in 2008. So we were integral in bringing Episerver over to North America. And you'll hear a little bit more about Deane Barker's involvement with that coming up next. But we're still proudly working with our first clients from 2009. So our relationships with Optimizely and Episerver clients have been longstanding, and we really look at ourselves as a partner to them. We're currently a gold partner for Optimizely and have our director of development who leads our dev team is in OMVP. So it's a very privileged thing to have not only certified developers on staff, but our own OMVP as well. So we're super proud of Bob Davidson. All right, so we're going to get started here. I don't want to take too much of Deane's time, but he is up next talking about the next generation content engine, which means he's going to be talking about the 4 principles that effective content teams use to maintain a steady flow of effective content. So a little bit about Deane. He also gets a fun little slide. Deane is actually a founder of Blend Interactive as well, and as during his time here at Blend, really became renowned as one of the foremost CMS experts in the industry, and so therefore it really made sense that he moved on to Optimizely to become the global director of content management. So Galactic Overlord is close. That was the title he always wanted, but this is pretty darn close. So Deane, we're super proud of you for moving on to a global position with Optimizely, and we're super excited to continue to work with you as a gold partner with Optimizely. You'll also note that Deane may not have quite become a tennis champ yet, but maybe someday. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to you, Deane.
Thank you very much. I think somebody needs to stop screen sharing so that I can start. This is the awkward time in every webinar where I ask if everybody can see my slides. We're good?
You're good, Deane.
We're good. Awesome. As Carla said, I was one of the founders of Blend back in 2005. Carla and I and Joe Kepley founded the company. I worked there for 15 years. I'm careful to say that I didn't run Blend for 15 years because I was terrible at running a business. So if anything, I was probably an impediment to running the business, but it did work there for 15 years. And I spent a lot of time working in content management. Blend has done content management really since its inception. And we worked with what was Episerver used to be a company called Optimizely used to be a company called Episerver. Worked with Episerver for many years. I think Blend had the first, second, and third sales in North America of the Episerver platform. Worked with that platform for 15 years at Blend and decided I loved it so much. It was kind of time to actually go work for that company. So I moved up to Optimizely in 2019, and I became their global director of content management. I'm really the product strategist for the CMS at Optimizely. I plan the direction of our content management system. Over the course of my career, I wrote a few books. I wrote the O'Reilly book on web content management back in 2016. Wrote a few other books. And then probably most importantly to this conversation, I wrote a book with Corey Vilhauer, who is the director of strategy at Blend, and he'll be talking later. Corey and I wrote a book called The Web Project Guide. You can actually see that entire book at webproject.guide. Corey and I are doing a podcast on it right now. So what I want to talk about is Avengers Endgame. And the reason why I want to talk about that is because there's this great scene at the end of Avengers Endgame that kind of looks like this. Captain America is like in a huge amount of trouble, doesn't know what he's going to do. And then suddenly these portals open and all of the other Avengers step out. And it's a great scene. Like everybody comes to rescue Captain America. And this, I think, is a metaphor for how the enterprise thinks content happens. They think that when they need content, just magic portals open up and content steps out. I think that people up the org chart don't have any understanding or often don't have an appreciation for the work it takes to generate content and create content over time. This is my favorite slide for how content is actually created. It's actually created by cats typing on keyboards. We all know that this is what it looks like when you actually create content. When I negotiated for my position here, when I was talking about it, I really concentrated on the idea of keyboard time. What I meant by keyboard time was that I had a lot of responsibilities here, but one thing I was going to need time with just me and a keyboard to create content. Honestly, I spent a lot of my time at Blend creating content, and it takes time. It takes time to write blog posts. It takes time to do videos. It takes time to do podcasts. And keyboard time is something that I think the organization doesn't understand or oftentimes respect. They think the content just like magically appears. I always love this quote by Red Smith. He was a sports writer back in the 40s. But it's a famous quote that's most well known for this. There's nothing to writing. All you have to do is sit down at a typewriter and open a vein. And the point to him is that creating content is kind of such an all absorptive thing. It's such a consumptive thing that you do. And people from the outside just think it's magic. They think content just kind of appears, and it really doesn't. This was the slide I used at the end of my keynote at Episerver's conference in 2019. I'd been working at the company for 6 weeks. They said, you got a keynote at our conference, so there's no pressure here. But this is the slide I put at the end of that, where I said Episerver is a content company. And it's important to note that a lot of CMS companies do a lot of different things. A lot of CMSs have evolved into what they call DXPs, digital experience platforms. And our company does a lot of things. We have an experimentation platform, we have commerce platforms, we have a recommendation engine, we have a customer data platform. We have an entire suite of products to manage the customer experience. But it really all boils down to content. And I truly do believe this. I think everything starts with content. I think the CMS is a backbone of a digital experience platform. For instance, experimentation, A/B testing is great, but you got to have an A and you got to have a B, and that's content. Everything comes down to content. I was on Amazon buying something the other day. And if you look like an Amazon page now, and an Amazon page is like evolved into like a mini website. I mean, there are multiple pictures and there are videos and you can click through all sorts of things. Buying a product on Amazon is a content experience. That product has evolved into a content experience. You can just also buy it. You can just buy effectively a content experience now, which I think is pretty amazing. So content, I think, is really central to everything. I always have thought that. I've come to love the term content engine. I stole this from an analyst, I think at Forrester. But a content engine is the combination of people, process, and platforms that enable the sustained, effective publishing of content. What's important that we're really talking about three different things. We're talking about people, so the human beings who create content. We're talking about processes, which is how content really moves through your organization, through its interactions with people. And then finally, we're talking about platforms. And this is the technical environment, its configuration and usage. This is how the people implement their process on the platform. I wrote this blog post back in 2006, and I'm willing to bet that Carla is horrified right now. And the reason why Carla is horrified is because that graphic was the first graphic I ever commissioned for a blog post. And Carla Santee designed that 17 years ago. But this blog post, famously internal to Optimizely, became a really rallying cry at this company. And the point I was making in this blog post is that the romantic lie of content creation is that when you have an idea for content, you immediately go to your CMS and open up your CMS. And that's just not what happens. I believe the first 85% of content production, content publication happens outside your CMS. And that's what I was getting across in this. And so the first 85%, this became a real rallying cry. And the reason why it became important to Optimizely is that we started to ask ourselves, are we truly supporting the real content process? We look at this, I believe, is the romantic lie of content creation. At the 0%, when someone gets the idea for content, they immediately rush to their CMS. And then at 100%, they put publish. I don't believe this is true. I think this is the last 15% of the life cycle of content production. I think what really happens is at 0%, someone's like, hey, we need some more content on the website. And then a lot of things happen. And then at about the 85% point, somebody finally logs into the CMS and starts creating content. And at Optimizely, we started to look at this kind of orange question mark area and ask ourselves, what are we doing to support this area? What are we doing to support these customers? And we realized we weren't really doing enough, and we weren't content just to be the last 15% of the process. So that's when we started looking around for a company to partner with. This is a slide that a friend and I put together. I don't expect you to read this whole thing. There's a lot of words here, but this is a slide put together last year, which is why people don't want to create content in their CMS. And there's a lot of reasons here, and they're very valid. I've tweeted this slide before. Happy to take a screenshot of it if you like. But there's all sorts of reasons why people don't want to create content in their CMS. And a lot of them are like social, psychological, emotional reasons, right? They're not sure this content is what they want to do. They don't want someone to accidentally publish it. They don't want someone to see it until it's ready. They're unsure of it. And these are why people don't want to create content in a CMS. So this brings us what's called a content marketing platform, or a CMP. I don't like that acronym. I think it should be like content collaboration platform. But then it would be CCP, which gets into like a weird acronym. But a content marketing platform, or CMP, assists in the planning, collaboration, and creation of content. A content marketing platform covers the first 85%. There are several different content marketing platforms on the market. One of the bigger ones was a company called Welcome Software, and we acquired them last January. So we acquired a piece of software which has now become Optimizely CMP, this product here. And our goal is to cover that first 85%. What a CMP really allows you to do is do things like editorial scheduling, task management, content workflow, campaign management. You can create content in a CMP. You can assign tasks to people. You can review. You can leave comments. You can do discussions. Everything that you would do to make sure that content's ready to go, everything that you would normally do in Google Docs or in Word, but in a much more structured, refined environment. And then finally, someone would log into your CMS and create it. And actually, we have a integration between our own CMS, and actually we have integrations with WordPress and Adobe Enterprise Manager as well, or Adobe Experience Manager, so that you can actually publish content directly from your CMP into your CMS. What I find is that a lot of companies really need this even more than they need a CMS, because they think a CMS is going to provide like complete order to their content process. And what they find out is that it doesn't. There's so many things that happen before somebody opens their CMS. So this is what we're talking about as a CMP. The question that we've been asking ourselves in working with Welcome and marketing CMP is really what makes a content engine run. When we talk about the people, processes, and platform, what makes a content engine produce a steady flow of effective content? And to this end, I've been doing an informal positive deviance study. And the phrase positive deviance comes from this book called The Power of Positive Deviance. And I apologize in advance because I read a lot, and this deck is going to be full of book recommendations. This is a pretty good one. This was written by somebody who studied nutrition in Vietnam. They were trying to find out where kids were malnourished in Vietnam. Well, instead of finding out all the problems, what they did is they did what's called a positive deviance study, where what they looked for is they looked for children who were well nourished. So they look for children that were above the norm in terms of body weight and standard deviance. And what they asked themselves is that, well, if we have this well-nourished child, what is different in this child's life? This child is deviating from the norm in a positive sense. So what is different? And they found all sorts of things. It's a fascinating book. They found all sorts of things about why children were well nourished, and that helped them figure out what people should do. And then the opposite of what they should do is where they found the problems. I've been doing an informal positive deviance study for several years now in content teams. I find teams that are well performing, that publish a lot of content and a steady, effective flow of content. And I'm asking myself, what are these teams doing? And then I'm talking to these content teams and saying, well, what's your secret? What are you doing? Tell me about your process. And I figured out 4 things that content teams do to publish content in a steady and effective manner. And I'm going to go through those 4 things now. And the first thing that I think effective content teams do to make their content teams run is they're really willing to get tactical. And I don't think that we like doing this in the enterprise. We don't like getting tactical. We like being strategic. And I say that as a product strategist. We like being strategic because it's kind of all the fun of planning with none of the accountability. We get to move the pieces around on the board, but we don't actually have to do anything. We're kind of like this guy, right? Yeah, if we could have some more case studies on the website, that'd be great. Well, okay, for what purpose and how are we going to get those out there? This is a very strategic level thinking. This is some kind of vague goal where there's no actual direction to this. I read this book, which was probably the best book I've ever read on business. It's called The 4 Disciplines of Execution. It was recommended to me by a friend. And this book taught me something very important. You cannot do goals. You can't do strategy. You can only do activities. Goals are fundamentally where you want to get to. An activity is how you get there. If you have a goal to drive to New York City, You can sit around all day and think about driving to New York City. You're not going to get any closer to New York City. The activity that's going to get you closer to New York City is to get in your car and actually start driving. We tend to talk about goals a lot, but we don't actually do anything. I wanted to write a book for years. That was a goal of mine. Well, I learned that writing a book is not magic. You sit down at a keyboard and you type a bunch of words in. It's like 144,000 words long. That's the activity that actually gets you there. We spend too much time thinking about goals, I think. I'm not saying goals aren't important. We spend a lot of time thinking about goals and not enough time thinking about activities. You need to identify the goals, but then you need to concentrate on what are called the activity streams. What are the activity streams that are reasonably likely to bring a goal about, to actually bring a goal into reality? I have two daughters in nursing school. I have one who's a junior and one who's a freshman in nursing school. And let's say they have a goal. They want to get an A in chemistry. As the person who's paying their tuition, I also very much would like them to get an A in chemistry. That's a great goal to have, but that doesn't help. You can sit around all day and think about getting an A in chemistry. It's not going to get you any closer to getting an A in chemistry. What you need to do is take the next step. Go from strategy to tactics. What actual things can you do on a day in and day out basis to get an A in chemistry? Well, here's an example. Here's some things that you might be able to do. You do all your reading assignments within 24 hours of them being assigned. Meet with a tutor once a week, meet with a study group once a week. If you predict 10 test questions every week, that was a great thing when I was studying in college. Sit down and ask yourself, if I was a professor and I was writing a test, what questions would I put on the test? So if you did all these things, if you did these things in the ES activities, can you reasonably assume that you would achieve that goal? I think it's fair to say that you would. The activities are the things that are actually going to get you there. Let's put this in content terms. Let's go back to the 4 disciplines of execution and let's talk about if we have a goal to increase the number of people who view a case study and then convert the same session. Well, what are we going to do to publish more case studies? Remember our manager saying, if we can get some more case studies on the website, that'd be great. What are we actually going to do to get there? On a monthly basis, what are we going to do? Here's some things that we could do. These are hypothetical. It might be different for everybody, but we want to execute a promotional campaign on the 2 case studies from last month. It's February. So we published 2 case studies in January. In February, we're going to run a promotional campaign on those 2 case studies to get eyeballs to those 2 case studies. What we're going to do now in February is we're going to publish 2 complete case studies in February. Now, what we also have to do, though, is we have to interview people and get media for the 2 case studies we plan to publish in March. And then also what we need to do is we need to identify the 2 customers that we're going to do in April. Remember, we're talking about a steady flow of content. These are the things that we have to do every single month. These are the activities. And you may look at this and think, well, that's kind of infantilizing it, isn't it? Well, that's really what we have to do. And I'm going to take this even further. There are 8 activities, right? There are 4 bullets and each bullet addresses 2 things we have to do. Let's put that on a point scale. So effectively, if you look at this body of work here, this activity stream, there are 8 points there. So can we say that for us to say that we had a successful month, we need to get at least 7 out of 8 points a month? And what if we put that on a scorecard somewhere? What if, like, on the intranet page of our team, we had a scorecard saying last month we got 7 out of 8 points. The month before that, we got 8 out of 8 points. What if we made that a goal for our team? If we achieve those activities, do we reasonably believe that would bring the goal about? And I think it's fair to say that it would. Transparency really encourages accountability. You need to be very, very transparent about these activity streams so that you can be accountable to these activity streams. It's not enough to year down the line and say, well, we really didn't publish enough case studies last year. The reason why you're a year down the line wondering that is because you weren't tracking it. You didn't have transparency into the process up until then. If you go with a plan that we articulated earlier, 8 points a month, you need to get at least 7. Well, if one month you only got 5, you know that you're falling behind. This keeps you accountable, this transparency. So questions that you need to ask really of your content team is for each goal, and I certainly hope that you do have goals, have you identified the productive activities that can reasonably produce that goal? Have you taken the next step from strategy, from goal to tactics to activity streams? Which did you spend more time on? Did you spend more time on the goals or the activity streams? I maintain you should spend more time on the activity streams. Do you have a scorecard? 4DX talks about a conspicuous scorecard. Do you have a scorecard and a platform to track these activities over time? And if you don't, we do. It's called the content marketing platform. And then have you articulated this activity goal dichotomy up the org chart? A lot of times the people above you on the org chart, they don't understand that Goals are just goals, and you're actually dealing with activities. And I believe it is professionally helpful for you to communicate this dichotomy of the org chart and say, look, these are our goals and these are the activities we're going to do. And look how we've done these past 2 and 3 months. People above you on the org chart, they want to know that your team is completing activities that reach goals. And if you don't reach your goals, you've learned something. Nobody can say you didn't do your job. You completed the activity. We didn't reach the goals. Now let's modify the activities. If the activities aren't bringing about the goal, let's change the activity stream. But you can't do that until you have an identified activity stream and you have accountability for that. So that's the first thing that I think effective content teams are doing in my experience. The second thing is you really need to widen the funnel and capture more ideas from more people. At many companies, content is created by a hallowed few people. And a lot of the companies complain about content, but they actually have no power to change it. And I think we do need to change that quite a bit. Creativity and innovation is really a team process. You need to enable ideas to flow in from the entire organization. One of the values of a CMP is that it allows anybody in the organization to file a content request. There's a system where they can go into your CMP. They can say, I think we should do this with this content. We should change this content. We should add this new piece of content. This content needs to be updated. This content needs to be deleted. It's kind of a clearinghouse for all the content requests. What that allows it to do is that creativity and innovation comes in from across the enterprise. I tweeted this last year sometime, and you're going to read this and think, what does this have to do with anything? I'm going to explain. I feel like we've reached a point in society and business when we're all expected to have a clear answer for everything all the time. We're not supposed to say we're undecided or we just don't know. I think this is true in American politics, especially. No American politician can say they don't know or they're researching an issue. They have to have an answer for everything all the time. And this is how business has become, I think. There's very little sense of experimentation in business these days. Nobody can say they don't know or they're just trying something. Everybody has to have the right answer all the time. Google did a research project that they called Project Aristotle. And what they did is they did a positive deviance study for teams. They found high-performing teams in the organization, and they asked themselves, what are these teams doing differently than all the other teams in the organization? What they found is the number one factor the high-performing teams had was psychological safety. Psychological safety is the idea that you can contribute to something and feel emotionally safe, like you're not going to be demoted, you're not going to be ridiculed, you're not going to be gossiped about or something like that. You can actually try something. You can take a risk. This is the idea of psychological safety. And sadly, I find this missing in a lot of organizations. There are many organizations where people act half terror all the time because they're afraid of making a mistake. And I think that this really needs to change. We need to change this, and we need to invite more people to bring ideas in from across the organization. You need an open, consistent, known place to capture ideas. You need a parking lot. When we were surveying companies in the CMP space, a certain company we looked at actually had the metaphor of a parking lot. There was a section in their piece of software they called a parking lot, and you could go there and park an idea. And we ended up not moving forward with that company, but I do like the idea of parking lot. It's a great metaphor. You need a place in your organization to park ideas. If somebody is on the way to the work and they see a billboard and they have an idea, they need a place to put that, because if you don't put that, you lose it. Additionally, somebody else in the organization may have the other half of a great idea. They may have the other half of that idea, and then they can add to your idea, and you can develop something creative and innovative that comes from the minds of two people instead of one. These are some great books that I've read about this concept. The one on the right, Getting Things Done, is kind of a standard book of personal productivity. If you haven't read that, I absolutely recommend it. The one on the left, very similar. I read that earlier this year, but it's about organizing all your different ideas. And the one in the middle is fascinating. Luis DeSalvo is a novelist, and she's talking about the art of slow writing, which she has some writing projects that she starts writing and then she sets aside for 5 years and comes back to. What's interesting is that all of these books in common recommend something as a base idea. And that thing is that you have to have a collection system. You have to have a parking lot. You have to have a place to put your ideas. You will come up with an idea that you cannot act on in that moment. You need to be able to save that idea. And when you're working in a team, you need to be able to save that idea in a platform, in a format where other people can pick that idea up or run with it. They can contribute to that idea. They're saying, you know, that's a great first idea, but I saw something else at a conference I was at last year that sort of relates to that, and maybe we could spin it in this direction. That's how creativity happens, and that's how innovation happens. You need a place to store ideas that people might connect later. Two people in your organization have opposite halves of a great idea, and you need to find a way to be able to put those ideas together. This is another great book. It's a legendary book of behavioral economics, Thinking Fast and Slow. And I love this book because Daniel Kahneman writes that don't worry if what you're saying seems muddled, contradictory, or simplistic. That's a crucial part of the thought process. We often need to say things out loud before it can be organized them. This is very true. I've been creating content for 15 years, 20 years. And when I start writing a blog post or I start putting together a presentation deck, it might be awful. And I'll get halfway into it and realize that I was talking about the same thing. I will completely change my premise. I will refine my premise. I will add to it. Very, very rarely do I start creating a piece of content and have it come out exactly how I thought it was going to. I generally change gears or change direction sometime in the process of making it. And that's part of the process. You need to start getting these things down in a parking lot so they can start to gel and they can start to turn into something better. So questions to ask. Does everyone in your organization believe they can and should contribute to content? Do they believe this is true, or does content only come from a hallowed group of people? Does everyone in your organization feel emotionally safe contributing to content? That's a problem that I can't fix for you. If you don't think people in your organization feel emotionally safe contributing to content, if you don't believe they have that psychological safety that Google was so important to high-performing teams, that's an organizational problem you need to solve. And then do you have a capture mechanism for ideas? Somebody in your organization has a great idea. They want someone to follow up on. They think this content would be great. They saw a billboard on the way to work, or they saw a blog post on a competitor's site, or they went to a conference and something sparked to their imagination. Can they capture that somewhere? Do they have a parking lot where they can put that and come back to it later? Those are questions I think you need to ask for your team. So that's the second thing. The third thing is you need to separate content from artifact. And in this section, I'm going to take some fault because I think as CMS vendors, we have been very, very poor at separating the ideas of content from artifact. Content authoring and artifact production are not the same thing. When you author content, you are articulating an idea. You're really codifying a thought. When you're producing an artifact, you are taking that idea and you are putting it into the specific medium from which it's going to be consumed. When we look at a web page, we have a tendency to look at that web page and say, oh, that's content. That's not content, that's a web page. The content is the idea behind it. Someone took that idea and turned it into a web page, but you could take that same idea and you could turn it into a LinkedIn post. You could turn it into a social media post. You could turn it into a tweet. You could turn it into a lot of things. The actual artifact that gets consumed is just a way that that idea gets out there. It's the message, it's the medium. So content is really the message. The artifact is just the thing it rides in on. Content is the message, the artifact is the tool. Content should publish to more than one artifact, and you need to design your content this way. This is my guilt slide. When I wanted to put the slide up, I looked for a picture of something that looked very guilty, and I think this dog looks very guilty. And the reason why is because I'm going to admit that vendors like us, we have confused content and artifact for too long. In Optimizely CMS, for a long time, if you created a piece of content, you were also creating a web page. That's not that way anymore. We've managed to separate those two things. But we have confused content and artifact. We've made it clear to editors that they're creating artifacts where really editors should be creating content. You should be creating ideas and then create artifacts from that. So this is really our fault. And I think the organization is maturing and evolving away from this to really separate the idea of content and artifact. This is my 4-layer model of DXP. I use this quite a bit to explain really what a DXP is. There's actually 5 layers here. The content strategy at the bottom, I don't think is really the domain of software. Your content strategy is your idea, your company's value proposition, what you plan to communicate to your customers. The first level of DXP, of where software, particularly our software, comes into play, is the idea of ideas and campaigns. This is where you capture and collaborate on ideas. Your team talks about ways that they can implement their content strategy. From that, you create content. Content goes through a management process. It's created and it's reviewed and it's collaborated on and it goes through workflow. From there, you produce artifacts. And this is the key shift between layers 2 and 3. One piece of content can and should turn into more than one artifact. If you have an idea, you should be looking at that and saying, what artifacts do we need to produce to communicate that idea? One of those artifacts undoubtedly would be a web page, but then could you do a LinkedIn update from the same idea, from the same piece of content? Can we do a tweet? Can we do something else? Can more than one artifact stem from this piece of content? And then the fourth layer, which is beyond the scope of this talk, is the layer of experience. There are tools now where you can optimize every individual experience of someone consuming your content. It's a great word I love. It's called qualia. I don't use it much because nobody knows what it means, but a qualia is the act of a human perceiving something. You eat an apple, the experience of yourself eating that apple, that is a qualia. A lot of people call that experience. There are tools now, we sell many of them, where you can actually broker and optimize each individual experience. So if you have a piece of content that generates an artifact, which is a web page, and then that web page is consumed 10,000 times, well, that's 10,000 experience. That's 10,000 qualia that you can optimize, you can experiment on, and you can personalize on, and you can enhance. So this is really the 4-layer stack, and layers 2 and 3 are critical. Too often we're combining layers of 2 and 3. We have an idea that came out of our campaign and we say, oh, well, we need to do something with that. So we go ahead and create an artifact. Well, let's not do that. Let's create some content first and then mine that content for additional artifacts. You need to create content with an eye towards more than one artifact. Don't be artifact centric, be content centric. You don't have to read this whole thing, but I put this together one evening, I think. This is why I don't have a social life, because I sit around in the evening and put things together like this. But these are variables in artifact composition. And what I want you to think about here, say you have an idea, say you've written something that communicates an idea about your product or your service or something you want to get out to your audience. These are all the different ways, all the different switches you can flip and dials you can turn on artifacts to get that out. You can choose what channel it goes in. You can choose how long is it going to be, a long blog post, short blog post, long video clip, short video clip. What voice is it going to be in? Is it going to be kind of formal from the organization? Is it going to be from a single person? It's going to be a single person's opinion. What's the tone going to be? How's it going to relate to other content? What follow-up is going to be a call to action? There's all sorts of different ways you can vary the artifact from the same piece of content. You can take content you published years ago, and I'll talk about that in a second, and just modify some dials and create different artifacts that might reach different audiences. The variables in artifact composition are the things you can use to reach different audiences. You can fiddle with the dials and create different artifacts and reach a whole different set of audiences. So questions to ask: do you create your content as an artifact? If you are creating your content as an artifact, I think effective content teams aren't doing that. They're creating content as content, and then they're examining it for what artifacts we should create. This idea that we've created, what's the best way to get this across? You might create something as a web page, get halfway through it and realize, holy cow, no one's going to pick this up as a web page. This should be something else. Well, if created content and artifact at the same time, that's not efficient. If you created your content and then completed the content, then you look at it and say, okay, what artifacts would best convey this message? And then do you examine content to spin off different artifacts? Do you look at content and think, okay, well, we did this. What other dials can we flip or can we spin to make this into a totally different style of artifact? So that's number 3. We need to separate content from artifact. Number 4 is save everything. Save everything you do. Always be prepared to reuse and remix. Another romantic lie of content creation is that everything is fresh and new, that everything we create, we totally create from scratch, and that it never existed before, and it was just kind of a bolt from the blue. And I absolutely don't believe that's true. Nothing we create is completely original. Everything that we create is guided or influenced by prior content or things that we've seen. This isn't a book recommendation, but I want you to go out to Google, or not Google, YouTube, and you search for Everything as a Remix. It's a 25-minute documentary. It's absolutely fascinating. The guy who did this documentary examines the idea of content creation and how we don't really create anything from scratch. What we do is we take all of these different content inputs that we have personally had over years and years and years, and we use that to formulate new content, if we realize it or not. He examines all sorts of areas. Spends a lot of time talking about Quentin Tarantino. Quentin Tarantino is kind of a master of paying homage to prior filmmakers. He has a bunch of clips in it like this. You know, on the left is The Searcher from 1956, and then Tarantino kind of recreated that entire shot. He does this all the time, apparently. It's absolutely fascinating to look at. He talks about technology, talks about Apple. When the Macintosh came out, I remember when the original Macintosh came out in like 84. Everyone thought that the windowed interface was like the most amazing thing in the world, and Apple had invented it. Apple didn't invent it. They kind of took it from Xerox PARC, and the actual details of how the idea got from Xerox to Apple are very much in dispute. But Steve Jobs, it's fair to say, Steve Jobs was a master at remixing. I maintain Steve Jobs didn't invent much. What he did is he took other people's inventions and he remixed them in a way to create something new. And then he marketed that in a new and interesting way. And if you think about it, that's the basis of invention. The basis of invention is that all technology is really built on a pyramid of innovation. Certain innovations happen, and then certain new innovations now become possible because of the prior innovations. So everybody rushes in and creates something new. There's this concept called simultaneous invention. Is the idea that very, very similar things were created at exactly the same time. And it seems like a wild coincidence. For example, did you know that 2 patents were filed for the light bulb? And those patents were filed 3 hours apart. 2 people working completely separately had the same idea for the light bulb. The same with the internet, like sequential routing. I mean, the basic feature of the internet, that was invented in both Europe and the US at about the same time by 2 teams who knew nothing about each other. And the reason for this is that as innovations happen, they make new innovations possible. And so people remix and transform the things that have happened previously. The video talks about the basic elements of creativity. And we think the basic elements of creativity are, I don't know, a gift from God. But it's not. We copy and we transform and we combine. The video manages to take a lot of the romance out of creativity. What we do is we see things that we like, we copy those things, we transform them, we change them a little bit, and we combine them with other things. This is also the story of programming. Nobody programs anything from scratch. What you do is you copy something you saw and you modify it, or you take libraries that somebody else has built and you combine those to create something new. This is a word that I really, really like. It's called pastiche. And I like this word because the root of this word comes from the same root for pasta and pastry. You like pasta and pastry, you love the word pastiche. Pastiche means to combine something from the past, combined things. And so the thing that you've done is just a combination of other things. And it's normally used as an insult because we want to look down on this idea of remixing and reusing content. We believe this romantic lie that everything we do is from scratch. And it's not. And I found this article, very dour looking man here, he's an architect. And he says, it's time to stop using pastiche as a pejorative term. We need to reclaim the term and celebrate the fact that precedent and tradition are at the heart of most good contemporary architecture. And the same thing is true of content. You copy and you remix and you transform content. This entire talk is really a copy. It's a remix of blog posts that I've written. You can go out to my author page on Optimizely, and you can find blog posts that really talk about the exact things I'm talking about here. I just talked things that I talked about. I remixed them. I separated the content from the artifact, and I created a new artifact. Was this talk? I kind of leveraged them in a different way. But to do this, you have to have access to all your past content. I think you have to look at your content as an evolving body of work. And a lot of organizations don't do this. They think every piece of content is kind of this brand new thing that they just gave birth to. You need to store content in a way that it can be remixed. You need to have a library. You need to have a content library where you store all the content your organization has ever published in such a way that it can be remixed. I do this. I have content going back years and years and years. And there are times where I'll just browse through my old content archives and find something and think, you know, the industry has changed a little way, so I could update this, but then I could publish this as a blog page, or I could make a session talk about it. This is what I do after a trip. I put this up here because when I first did this talk, I had just come back from London and Stockholm. And this is what I do when I come back from a trip. This is what I call receipt archaeology. And Carla's probably laughing right now because I used to do this all the time at Blend. I would get back from a trip and I would just have this massive pile of receipts. And I had to figure out, I had to do archaeology, right? I had to figure out what receipt went with what expense. And this is what we do with content. We do content archaeology. We think to ourselves, okay, well, we want to do this campaign. And we think, well, we either got to do it from scratch, but didn't we do something like this last year? Where can we find that content? What about that asset we had? We had that video clip of that one guy talking about that one thing. Where is that? And you have to do archaeology. You have to recreate all this stuff. And we need to stop doing this. You need to have a common content library organization. And you need to treat the body of content the organization publishes as an evolving body of work, not something you do from scratch every time. For this, actually, yesterday, to prove this point, I actually went back in my personal content archive and I found these two files. Just put that in the zip code. This was my very first conference presentation I did in 2009. It was in Chicago. And then in Sweden, I did one called Joining the Conversation. I did that for the very first Episerver Partner Summit. I keep all of my content. In fact, I publish most of it. If you go to my website, deanebarker.net, I publish most of my content out there, but I absolutely keep all of it. I can refer back to anything that I have ever created for a customer, for a conference presentation, for a campaign. I keep every bit of it and I constantly reuse it. You will be surprised at how often you refer to this content. So the questions you need to ask is, do you treat your content as an evolving body of work? And then if someone wanted to remix some of your older content, where would they find the assets? Do you have access to that older content? When you bring someone new into your team, do they have access to all the content your team has created? Do you look at the content your organization creates as this body of work that you keep adding to, or do you throw it away and start from scratch every time? Effective content teams keep content. They have a central content library that they can refer back to. The question I want to ask you is why don't we care as much about content failures as we do about code failures? I've been thinking about this a lot. I'm a developer by trade. I'm an engineer. In fact, I developed at Blend for many, many different years. And there's a concept in programming called DevOps, the development operations. And this is the process by which code gets from a developer's fingertips out to like a production running system. And here's an example of a DevOps diagram. I don't know whose this is. I just Googled DevOps diagram and this came out. And you can see it's very, very complicated. To actually get a piece of code out to production, we go through all these processes. We have all these environments, we run all these tests, and we do all these reviews because we're paranoid about code failures. But for some reason, we're not as paranoid about content failures. Never quite understood that. If you're an organization that wants to get your software in an analyst report, and you've been pursuing this analyst for months saying, we'd really like our software in your report, and this is why. And so one day the analyst finally goes to your website and starts looking around your website to see what all the fuss is about. Doesn't really find anything interesting out there, doesn't find anything that applies, nothing that you've said to him in the past kind of matches what he's seeing on your website. So he goes away and you don't end up in that analyst report. This is a content failure, and this is quieter than a code failure. There's no apparent error to a content failure. Things just don't pan out the way they hoped. These cause far more damage than code failures, but we're somehow so much more obsessed with code failures. We have DevOps processes that have been refined and they're incredibly stringent and detailed. Do you have content ops processes? Do you take your content as seriously as you take your code? The last question I want to talk to you about is in your organization, I think you need to ask, where does content begin? I ask this question to a lot of companies. Where does content begin? Where is some idea that you have for content? Where did that spark come to life? I was reading this book. I'm not presenting this as official book recommendation. It was okay. It's a book about the Seine. It's the river that goes through Paris. I don't know why I ended up with this book. I think it was like buy two, get one free, but I read it and it was interesting. When you think about the Seine, you think about things like this, right? Grand, this, I think is that Notre Dame in the back? I don't know. Or things like this, right? The Seine. This picture I took myself, which is why it's terrible. This picture is gorgeous. This picture is not. And it's because I took this myself. It was like 7 in the morning. It was hardly any light, but I was stuck overnight in Paris because our friends went on strike. But this is the Seine, right? Flowing past the Eiffel Tower. This is what we think about all the time. In fact, if you Google for the Seine, these are the pictures you get. And this is what we think of when we think of the Seine. But the Seine doesn't start in Paris. The Seine actually starts way down here in Dijon. The Seine's about 500 miles long. Only about 41 of those miles goes through Paris. So less than 10% of the Seine actually flows through Paris. This is where the Seine actually starts, underneath this rock. This is the Seine in Dijon. So that footbridge over there, that's technically the first bridge over the Seine. The spring is actually literally underneath this block. And you're asking yourself, well, what are you talking about? And what I'm talking about is that we tend to treat our content like the Seine. We only think of our content as it flows through our CMS. We don't think of all the things that happen with our content before it got there. The glamour moment for content is when it hits our CMS and gets published through our CMS. But what happened before that? Like, where does content begin? Where did it start? Where does somebody get the idea? What are all the different things they went through to actually create an artifact from that content? That's magic land for most organizations. It's just kind of this vague thing that sort of happens. And I think it needs to stop happening. We bought a content management platform. We acquired a CMP last year, specifically because we wanted to address this for our customers. And so I'd ask you to think about this. The one takeaway you could take from this is to think about, where does our content begin? What is the process from the initial flame, the spark of imagination, through to getting content published? And is that well managed? Can we implement these 4 principles of effective content teams in that particular process? And if you talk about where your content begins, and you talk to your team, you talk to your coworkers, you might find it begins far, far more early than you think it does. There's this gray area where a lot of things happen and nobody's tracking anything that can really be refined. That's where an effective content engine starts. That's all I had. Thank you very much for listening. I will turn it back over to Carla.